Christopher Rufo is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute and contributing editor at City Journal. He's been on the leading front of battling CRT, critical race theory, and the latest attack is from the ACLU, who says that state lawmakers are trying to ban discussions of race, that's the characterization, altogether from the classroom, and they say that's an infringement on student rights. I'm not quite sure that that's the best way to frame that. Christopher Rufo joins us now. Christopher, it's good to be with you. I appreciate your work also on CRT. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, absolutely. It's great to be with you. And this is an absolutely ridiculous, atrocious, flat out lie from the ACLU. It doesn't ban the teaching of history about racism. It bans teachers practicing racism in the classroom. It's a very different thing. You can teach about slavery, segregation, historical injustices in any state in the union. I think that's important. That's a kind of universal opinion. But what you can't do is you can't practice race essentialism, judging students on the basis of race, or we're saying that all members of racial group A are bad in these ways, X, Y, and Z. You can't assign collective guilt. So you can't say if you're a member of a certain racial group, you're responsible for historical crimes. And you can't also practice segregation. So you can't actually split students on the basis of race into different classrooms, different training sessions. This is very simple. It prevents state-sanctioned racism. The ACLU should frankly be ashamed of itself for peddling these lies.
Yeah, I think that's the mystifying thing. No one ever said that you couldn't talk about race, but it's just as you said, it's actually teaching division. Now because I want to talk about that more, but you also, I'm looking at your website, you also wrote a really great primer on critical race theory, because I think that that's the big struggle that a lot of parents have. I mean, they're not really in some of these philosophical or, all these offshoot of Marxist theory areas. They just know that what they're seeing in their child's material and what they're hearing from educators in the classroom is off. It's wrong. And some of the parents, like in my town, we had a huge fight over this, where we had a school board battle and we won by over 70% of the vote. And it was a lot of minority families that were speaking out against this, because they were saying that it teaches division and it teaches segregation. And I wanted to pull up at ChristopherRufo.com, you go into winning the language war, and you also get into, this is how it's defined. This is how critical race theory is defined. If you're talking to parents, Christopher, and you're trying to give them pointers, because if you're explaining you're losing is the golden rule in politics, how would you tell them to address this, define it, and just put it out there for people in like 30 seconds, like an elevator pitch?
Yeah, I would say that critical race theory is a form of race-based Marxism. It seeks to divide the world into oppressor and oppressed based on skin color, and is a political ideology that has no place in the classroom. You can say that and repeat that exact phrase. I think it's accurate, it's punchy, it's effective. And I put together this briefing book to provide parents who are really busy taking care of their kids, going to their jobs, a place where in 30 minutes of reading, they can digest what critical race theory is, what are the key texts and beliefs, what are the key concepts, and how to speak about it in a way that's effective, that reaches a broad range of people. And this is exactly what's needed, because people are up in arms. I'm just trying to provide them with the language and the knowledge that they need in order to be successful in fighting back.
And that language, as you say, is super important. Parents have to win the language war on this. Talk a little bit about that. Like, I like how you said that this is Marxist racism, because that's exactly what it is. And language is super important in this.
Yeah, I think it's important, too, to think of this in terms of critical race theory in the classroom as a form of state-sanctioned racism. It's taxpayer dollars being used to fund an ideology that explicitly separates people into racial categories and loads them with connotations, saying that these people are bad because of their whiteness, these people are inherently good because of their other attributes. And this has no place in the classroom. It's a form of racism funded by the state, and I think that we should limit it. If you want to promote critical race theory on your own time and with your own money, that's fine. You're protected by the First Amendment, so you can actually say whatever you want. But you're not entitled to use taxpayer money to fund your ideology. That's up to the voters. That's up to the Constitution. And I think we have a very strong argument that all funding should be stripped away from critical race theory in the classroom. And if there are instances in states where they're practicing it, we're going to be taking it to court and showing that it's not only intellectually bankrupt, but it's actually a violation of existing law.
Yeah, absolutely. We're talking to Christopher Rufo, who's been the kind of the tip of the spear on this with CRT. When Andrew Breitbart was alive, and this was, I think, this was obviously before 2012, I remember there was a story, and we were writing different things about it. Derek Bell and then President Barack Obama, and Derek Bell's pioneering of critical race theory, which seemed really at the time kind of archaic. And why is this so important now? And it has been like lightning speed. We went from talking about a situation with Derek Bell, and then everything was very quiet. And then, Christopher, we just noticed around the country, as you did too, which is why you started really pushing this and leading this effort, all these different schools, and it didn't matter if it was an affluent area or not. There was no rhyme or reason, just every school around the country, this kind of curriculum that was CRT inspired, even if they wouldn't say it in name, began popping up everywhere. So how did we get from this being this really kind of archaic thing that seemed to be left in the 60s to now it's in every school, and it's even being taught in elementary school?
Well, I think the reason practically is because they've been designing this strategy for 40 years, where they take these ideas from critical theory, from neo-Marxism, from critical race theory, and then they train university students, and very importantly, they train teachers' colleges, so state colleges of education, where they're putting this ideology into the minds of our future teachers. And guess what? When you fast forward 10, 15, 20 years, this is what they've absorbed in their teachers' education. They're now applying it to the classroom. So what I've seen in my reporting is a huge division where you have older teachers that are following a traditional pedagogy. They're teaching an honest and accurate view of history. But those teachers that are under the age of 35 are bringing in these ideas that they learned in these graduate schools of education that are deeply influenced by critical race theory, critical pedagogy, critical gender theory. And that's what we're having being pushed in our classrooms, and they're being funded again by taxpayers. So listen up, everyone. You have an option to have this in your state, in your school district, or not, but you have to get activated. You have to figure out what's happening, and you have to fight at every step of the way to make sure that you are not funding state-sanctioned racism, and you are not funding a critical race theory in your local education system.
I love how in your briefing book you give some of the best practices, actually some of the strongest attacks against critical race theory. And some of these stories, there are things in here I haven't even heard of that you have. I mean, you have a huge list of actual real life examples of critical race theory under using stories to build the argument in practice. And I mean, I'm amazed at some of this. When parents tell these stories and when they put this into, meat space, into reality, that seems to be, as you said, the most effective way to countermeasure and counter-argue this CRT. And I'm sure that there's even more than you have listed here.
Yeah, that's right. Those are just the stories that I've broken, but you're precisely right. If I tell you critical race theory is an intellectually bankrupt ideology, we can debate about that in the abstract. But if I tell you in Cupertino, California, they're taking third graders and they're separating them into oppressor and oppressed and forcing them to atone for their power and privilege, all of a sudden that hits home. It's emotional. It drives people. Because the problem is not that critical race theory intellectually is a flawed theory. It is. The problem is that critical race theory applied in the classroom is hurting children. Mm-hmm. And when you start hurting people's children, that's when people wake up, that's when people take action, and that's when people are going to say, enough is enough.
And that's the big thing. You're exactly right. It's hurting children. What are some of the results that you've been seeing? Because obviously, I mean, I know that it's still probably some of the kids that have been maybe early recipients of this kind of ridiculous, not really education are maybe still in school, maybe in junior high, high school. But are there any studies, or are there any kind of stories that talk about like maybe how do these kids feel? How are they turning out after being indoctrinated like this? It's abusive.
Yeah, I actually just released a months-long investigation of critical race theory in Portland, Oregon area schools. And what I found is that Portland, Oregon was one of the first adopters of this ideology. They've been doing these training programs for almost, for actually more than a decade. And what we see is that when they're training students to become race revolutionaries, when they're telling white students that they need to fundamentally reshape their white identity and become essentially apostles of white privilege and white fragility and white reconstruction, what you see, it ends up in almost every case in anger, in rage, in this kind of destructive impulse. And then what you see, I think, is very clear, a connection from this ideology in schools and other institutions to the violence in the streets. In Portland, Oregon, over the last year, you've had dozens of minors Dozens of children and teenagers get arrested for vandalism, arson, rioting, destruction, gun charges. And it's fueled by this ideology and then put into practice in the streets. The recipe is a recipe for disaster. It's a recipe for unrest, for violence, for destruction. It's a philosophy that seeks to negate a reality, to cancel reality, and then to fight to create this utopia that they believe can happen. So it's deeply destructive, and parents all over the country should look at Portland, Oregon as a cautionary tale.
Yeah, and I've seen so many parents speaking out about this. It's so weird because of all of the criticism of CRT, and I realize that people try to make it seem like it's just white people that are complaining about it. The people that I've seen actually really talking about it the most are minority parents. One last question for you with this. You get into, and this is a phrase I honestly had not heard until actually just a couple of months ago, race abolitionism, and not like abolition the way that we would think of it historically, like Elijah Lovejoy and the Quakers, and not that kind of abolitionism, but race abolitionism. And talk to me, because tell me how CRT defines that, because this is scary stuff.
Yeah, there's an academic named Noel Ignatieff who popularized this idea of abolishing the white race. And what that means is kind of a dual meaning. They say that it's abolishing whiteness as a social construction, as a set of cultural practices, as an arrangement of power. But this is really ugly language. If you said abolish the race of any other race or ethnicity, it would immediately set up the alarms. And this is becoming really common practice. I reported on a story from New York City in which a public high school teacher sent an email to white parents saying that they need to become, quote, white traitors, and then, quote, advocate for white abolition. This is kind of a euphemism that verges on almost genocidal language. It's really toxic and ugly stuff. There's no way these ideas, if they hit the mainstream, are going to end with a transcendence of racial differences, a coming together across racial differences. This is really pitting American against American in the ugliest and most divisive way possible.
It sounds like ethnic cleansing is what it sounds like. It definitely sounds like the opposite of e pluribus unum. For sure. Very anti-American indeed. Christopher Rufo, ChristopherRufo.com. Go and read his briefing on this. And you have that just for free for everybody. That's awesome. Thank you so much for your work that you've done on this and all you've done to make sure that parents know what they're up against in schools. I know that it's helped our town immensely and so many others. I know there's 2 other towns next to ours that are now in that exact same fight now. So that was a lot of work to be done.